when I decided to paint my fence. Little did I know Karen next door would call the cops, and the HOA would unleash fines on me. Could standing up to the neighborhood tyrant turn my simple project into a full-blown battle? I always loved taking care of my little house. It wasn't the biggest or the fanciest, but it was mine, and I took pride in every little thing about it. One sunny Saturday morning, I decided it was time to paint my fence. The old paint was peeling, and the white color had faded under the relentless sun. I had saved up for months to buy the best blue paint, hoping it would give my yard a fresh, cheerful look. As I stood in front of the fence, brush in hand, I felt a wave of satisfaction. The first strokes of blue transformed the dull, weathered wood into something vibrant and inviting. I could already imagine how much nicer the yard would look once the job was done. My neighbors watched me with mixed expressions, some curious, some indifferent, and a few with clearly annoyed looks. Karen, my next-door neighbor, was the most noticeable. She always seemed to have something to say about everything. With her perfectly manicured garden and spotless house, Karen took pride in keeping everything just so. Her eyes narrowed as she watched me paint, and I could tell she wasn't pleased. "Are you sure that's an approved color?" Karen called out from her porch, her voice sharp and demanding. I smiled politely, trying to keep the peace. "Yes, Karen, I checked the HOA guidelines. Blue is within the approved palette." She huffed and turned away, but not before muttering something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. I tried to ignore her, focusing on the fence instead. But her disapproval lingered in the air, making me uneasy. As the day went on, more neighbors peeked over their fences or glanced out their windows. Some offered polite nods, while others continued their conversations. Clearly annoyed by the disruption, I kept working, determined to finish before the sunset. The blue was looking great, and I was proud of the progress I was making. Later that evening, as I was putting away my tools, Karen approached me again. This time her expression was even more stern. "You know, painting the fence without proper approval can lead to issues with the HOA," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I took a deep breath, staying calm. I followed all the guidelines. "Karen, if there's a problem, I'm happy to discuss it with the HOA board." She shook her head, clearly not satisfied with my response. "I'll be keeping an eye on this," she declared before walking back to her house. I tried to brush off the encounter, telling myself that maybe Karen was just being overly particular. But as days passed, I started noticing more of her watching me. Every time I took out my paint, Karen seemed to be nearby, making sure everything was done properly. One afternoon, while I was painting a particularly tricky section of the fence, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced up to see flashing lights in the distance growing closer by the second. Panic set in as I wondered what was happening. The police arrived shortly after, and Karen was there too, pointing out every little thing she thought I had done wrong. The officers listened patiently, but the tension in the air was thick. They took my statements and assured me they would look into the matter. I felt a knot form in my stomach, unsure of what was going to happen next. That evening, I sat down at my computer, still shaken from the day's events. I decided to turn to Reddit, hoping to find others who might have faced similar issues. I shared my story, detailing how I had followed the guidelines and how Karen had suddenly become so aggressive. Within minutes, responses started pouring in. Some people offered sympathy, while others shared their own experiences with difficult neighbors and strict HOAs. One comment stood out. "It sounds like Karen is trying to intimidate you. Have you considered documenting everything and reaching out to the local news? Sometimes public exposure can help." I hadn't thought about going to the media, but it made sense. If Karen was making such a big deal out of something minor, maybe getting others involved would show the HOA that I wasn't the problem. The next morning, I decided to take action. I reviewed the HOA guidelines again, making sure I hadn't missed anything. I also looked up property maps and local regulations, gathering all the information I could to support my case. Feeling more prepared, I planned to attend the next HOA meeting to present my side of the story. But just as I was getting ready, I received a call from the HOA board. They wanted to schedule a hearing to discuss the alleged violations. My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had done nothing wrong and that I had the evidence to prove it. As the day of the hearing approached, the tension in the neighborhood seemed to grow. Neighbors I had never spoken to before began whispering behind closed doors, and I could feel their eyes on me whenever I walked past. It was as if Karen had turned the whole community against me, painting me as the bad guy for wanting to improve my home. I spent hours preparing my presentation, organizing all the documents and photos that showed I had followed the rules to the letter. I even reached out to a few supportive neighbors I knew could vouch for my character. Despite the growing pressure, I remained determined to stand my ground. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen. Would the board believe Karen over me? What if they fined me or even forced me to remove the paint? I knew I had to stay strong, not just for myself, but for anyone else who might face similar challenges in the future. The next morning, I walked into the HOA office with my documents neatly organized in a folder. The board members looked up as I entered, and I could see Karen sitting there with a smug expression. I took a deep breath and began to present my case, calmly explaining how I had adhered to all the guidelines and showing the evidence I had gathered. Karen interrupted me several times, pointing out minor details and trying to undermine my efforts, but I stayed focused, addressing each of her concerns with facts and maintaining my composure. The board members listened attentively, occasionally glancing at each other as the tension in the room mounted. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more difficult, one of the board members asked a question that caught me off guard. Are you aware that your painting has caused a significant drop in property values in the neighborhood? My heart sank. I hadn't considered that angle, I responded honestly, explaining that I hadn't seen any evidence to support that claim and that it was unlikely one fence would have such a large impact. I offered to get an independent appraisal if necessary, hoping to show that I was willing to cooperate and find a fair solution. As the meeting drew to a close, it seemed like no resolution was in sight. Karen continued to dominate the conversation, and the board members appeared divided. I left the meeting feeling defeated, unsure of what the next steps would be. But deep down, I knew I couldn't give up. There had to be a way to clear my name and stand up to Karen's relentless pressure. That night, I returned to Reddit, sharing the outcome of the hearing and seeking further advice. The community's support was unwavering, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. Someone suggested organizing a neighborhood petition to show that not everyone was against me, while another recommended reaching out to a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. With so many options, I felt more hopeful than I had in days. I began to plan my next moves, knowing that the battle wasn't over yet. Karen's overbearing nature had turned a simple fence painting into a full-blown conflict, but I was ready to fight for what was right. I wasn't just defending my fence anymore. I was standing up for fairness and community spirit. As I looked out my window at the newly painted blue fence, I felt a mix of pride and anxiety. The journey ahead would be challenging, but I was determined to see it through. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight, one that would test my resilience and the strength of the community around me. The morning after painting my fence, I woke up feeling proud. The blue color looked great in the sunlight. But my happiness was short-lived. I heard a loud knock on my door. My heart pounded as I opened it to see two police officers standing there. "Good morning," one said. Karen reported a violation. My stomach dropped. I tried to stay calm. "What violation?" I asked. The officers looked serious. "You painted your fence without approval from the HOA," one explained. I felt a mix of fear and frustration. I knew I followed the basic rules, but maybe I missed something. As the officers took notes, Karen stood nearby, arms crossed and a stern expression on her face. "I told them it wasn't the right color," she said loudly. Her voice echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "I believe I followed the guidelines," I replied calmly. The officers nodded but didn't seem convinced. They left after a few tense minutes, leaving me standing there with a heavy heart. That afternoon, I received a letter from the HOA. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter stated that I had violated HOA rules and imposed a hefty fine. My mind raced. I couldn't afford this, and it felt so unfair. Determined to fight back, I turned to Reddit, hoping to find advice from others who had faced similar issues. I posted my story in a local community thread, explaining how Karen had called the cops just for painting my fence. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. People shared their own experiences with Karen and the HOA, offering support and suggestions. One user recommended looking into the HOA's official documents to understand the rules better. Another suggested reaching out to a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Encouraged by the support, I felt a glimmer of hope. That evening, I sat at my computer, digging through the HOA's guidelines. I discovered that the color I chose was actually allowed, as long as it wasn't too bright. My fence was within the acceptable range. Armed with this information, I felt more confident. I replied to the Reddit thread, sharing my findings and asking for more advice on how to proceed. The community rallied around me, offering to help spread the word and gather evidence. However, not everything was going smoothly. The next day, I noticed that some of my neighbors, who were usually friendly, started avoiding me. They would give me curt nods or hurried greetings, but nothing more. It felt isolating, and I couldn't help but wonder if Karen had influenced their behavior. My anxiety grew as I realized that Karen might have more power and connections within the HOA than I initially thought. Determined not to back down, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. I wanted to present my case and show that I wasn't violating any rules. But before the meeting, I received a private message on Reddit from an anonymous user. The message was short but chilling. Be careful. Karen isn't who she seems. There's more to her plans. My curiosity was piqued, and a sense of unease settled over me. What was Karen hiding, and how deep did her influence go? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the anonymous message and what it might mean. Could Karen be involved in something bigger than just enforcing HOA rules? I decided to investigate further. I started looking into Karen's history, searching public records and old news articles. To my surprise, I found a few troubling stories about her. There were whispers of past disputes with other neighbors and rumors that she had a close relationship with several HOA board members. As I pieced together the information, a pattern began to emerge. It seemed that Karen had a knack for turning minor disagreements into major conflicts, often with the support of the HOA. Her actions were not just about maintaining the neighborhood's appearance, but also about controlling who lived there. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that my fence painting was just the beginning. Determined to gather more evidence, I reached out to some of the supportive Reddit users. Together, we compiled stories and documented instances where Karen had overstepped her boundaries. We even found old meeting minutes that showed her influence on the HOA's decisions. With this information, I felt ready to take the fight to the HOA board. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I walked into the community center with a mix of fear and determination. Karen was already there, looking as confident and unbothered as ever. The room was filled with fellow homeowners, many of whom I now saw as either allies or silent supporters of Karen. As the meeting began, I stood up to present my case, holding all the evidence I had gathered. Karen interrupted me, her voice sharp. "This is just another example of someone trying to disrupt our community standards," she said, turning to the board members for support. I took a deep breath and continued, showing the documents and testimonies that proved my point. The room was silent, eyes shifting between Karen and me. It was clear that the tension was at its peak, and the outcome of this meeting would determine the future of our neighborhood. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't just upset about my fence. Determined to find out why she was so against me, I decided to dig deeper. The first thing I did was visit Reddit again, hoping someone might know more about Karen. I typed her name into the search bar and started reading through old posts. To my surprise, I found several threads where other neighbors talked about Karen's strict rules and how she always seemed to have a problem with something. Excited by this discovery, I decided to look into the HOA's records. I went to the local library and asked the librarian for property maps and any documents related to our neighborhood's rules. While flipping through the maps, I noticed that Karen owned more than her fair share of properties. This seemed odd. Why would someone need so many houses? Back at home, I took the maps and started making connections. I realized that Karen's properties were all strategically placed to control the neighborhood's decisions. It was like she was the queen of our little town. This made me even more curious and worried. What was Karen really up to? I knew I needed more proof, so I decided to talk to some of my neighbors. I reached out to them one by one, sharing my findings and asking if they had noticed anything strange about Karen. At first, most people were hesitant to talk. Karen was well liked on the surface, and no one wanted to cause trouble. But after a few encouraging words, some neighbors began to open up. They shared stories of how Karen had enforced rules that seemed unnecessary or unfair, always making sure her way was the only way. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, mentioned how Karen had once tried to stop a family from planting a garden because she thought the flowers were too bright. Another neighbor, Tom, said Karen had complained about the height of his holiday decorations, even though they were well within the guidelines. These stories painted a picture of Karen as someone who wanted everything her way, no matter what. Feeling more confident, I decided to gather all this information and present it to the HOA board. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to stand up against Karen's unfair tactics. I spent evenings compiling my research, organizing the property maps, and writing down all the instances where Karen had overstepped her bounds. I even included screenshots of the Reddit threads that supported my case. The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. Will the board believe me? Can I really take on Karen and the HOA? I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't just about my fence anymore. It was about fairness and standing up for what was right. The next morning, I arrived early at the HOA office. The board members were already gathering, and I could feel the tension in the air. Karen walked in shortly after, her expression as stern as ever. She didn't say much, but her eyes were fixed on me, making me feel like I was the problem. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and began presenting my findings. I showed the property maps, pointing out how Karen's holdings gave her undue influence over the neighborhood's decisions. I shared the stories from my neighbors, emphasizing how Karen's actions had made life difficult for many of us. Finally, I presented the Reddit threads as evidence of Karen's pattern of behavior. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice sharp. "These are just baseless accusations. You're trying to ruin my reputation over a fence." But I stayed calm and continued. "It's not just about the fence, Karen. It's about how you've been using your position to control the neighborhood. This isn't fair to the rest of us." The board members looked at each other, some nodding in agreement, while others seemed unsure. I could feel Karen's frustration growing, but I held my ground. Just when it seemed like the meeting was going nowhere, one of the board members, Mr. Lee, stood up. "I think we need to investigate these claims further," he said. "If what you're saying is true, Karen, then this needs to be addressed." Karen's face turned red with anger. "This is ridiculous. I've done nothing wrong." As the meeting continued, it became clear that the board was taking my evidence seriously. They decided to form a committee to look into Karen's actions and the HOA's regulations. This was a small victory, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. That evening, I received an anonymous message on Reddit. It read, "Be careful what you dig up. Karen has ways to make things difficult for you." My heart sank. Could Karen retaliate against me even more? Determined not to back down, I reached out to a local journalist I knew from school. I shared my story and all the evidence I had gathered. The journalist was interested and agreed to help expose the truth about Karen and the HOA. This was exactly the support I needed to keep going. The next day, I felt a surge of hope. With the media now involved, Karen's influence would be harder to hide. I spent hours preparing for the upcoming board meeting, making sure I had all my facts straight and was ready to present my case clearly. As the days passed, more neighbors came forward to support me. They shared their own experiences and provided additional evidence of Karen's controlling behavior. It felt like a weight was lifting off my shoulders as the community began to unite against the unfairness. But just when things were starting to look up, I discovered something shocking. Karen had been secretly recording conversations and taking photos of me without my knowledge. She was gathering evidence to use against me in any future confrontations. I felt a wave of fear and frustration. How could she go this far? Instead of letting this discourage me, I decided to use it to my advantage. I informed the board and the journalist about Karen's secret recordings. This added another layer to the story and showed just how desperate Karen was to maintain her control. With all the evidence in hand, the stage was set for the final showdown. The board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I knew it was my last chance to make things right. I felt a mix of nerves and determination as I prepared to face Karen and the HOA one more time. As the day of the meeting approached, I couldn't help but wonder if all my efforts would pay off. Could I truly bring down Karen's reign and restore peace to our neighborhood? The answer lay just around the corner, and I was ready to fight for what was right. The HOA meeting day arrived, and my heart pounded as I walked into the community hall. The room was filled with neighbors, all eyes on me and Karen. I took a deep breath, remembering the support I had from Reddit and the research I had done. I knew this was my chance to set things right. Karen stood at the front, her posture demanding attention. She began her speech confidently, showing photos of my freshly painted fence. "Look at this. Clearly he didn't follow the HOA guidelines," she declared, pointing to the blue paint. I could see some neighbors nodding, but others looked unsure. I felt a surge of determination. This was my moment to speak. When it was my turn, I stood up calmly. "I understand your concerns, Karen, but I did my research. The color I chose is within the HOA's guidelines," I explained, showing the property map and the official color chart I had printed. The room was silent, but I could feel eyes on me, some curious, some skeptical. Karen wasn't done. She called a few neighbors to testify against me, but I listened carefully. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and said, "I reached out to our online community on Reddit, and many people have faced similar issues. We're not the only ones who want our neighborhood to be a great place." Murmurs spread through the room. I could see Karen's frustration growing, but I stayed calm and continued. Just when it seemed like Karen was winning, one of my Reddit friends, Lisa, stood up. "I saw Karen speaking to others about how she wants everything perfect. I think she's being unfair to some of us," Lisa said, looking around the room. People started whispering and nodding. Karen tried to stay strong, but her confidence was shaking. I took this chance to present more evidence. I found old HOA meeting notes that show the rules were changed recently, and these changes weren't properly communicated to everyone, I said, showing the documents on my tablet. The board members leaned in, reading the notes. Some looked surprised, others concerned. This was turning in my favor. Karen quickly responded, but I was prepared. These changes are new, and many of us weren't informed. It's not fair to fine someone for something we didn't know was wrong, I argued. The room was filled with tension. I could see Karen's face reddening, her control slipping. Another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, stood up. I used to work with Karen, and I know she likes things her way. Maybe she's pushing too hard on these rules, he said, looking directly at Karen. The room was buzzing now, with more neighbors questioning Karen's motives. I felt a wave of relief, but knew I had to keep pushing. I decided to bring in media exposure. I wrote about this situation on Reddit, and it gained a lot of attention. If the HOA doesn't listen, we can share our story with the local news, I threatened gently. The idea of media attention made some board members uneasy. Karen tried to laugh it off, but her facade was cracking. As the meeting continued, emotions ran high. Some neighbors stood up to support me, sharing their own stories of feeling pressured by Karen and the HOA. It felt like a wave of truth was washing over the room. I stayed focused, presenting my case clearly and calmly. Just when it seemed like the board might side with Karen, another key witness stepped forward. It was Mrs. Ramirez, a quiet neighbor who had never spoken up before. I used to be friends with Karen, but she's been very strict and unfair lately. She pressured me to change my garden without proper notice, Mrs. Ramirez said, her voice trembling. She showed messages Karen had sent her, demanding changes and threatening fines. The room went silent. This was the breakthrough I needed. The board members huddled together, discussing the new evidence. I could feel the tension in the room, waiting for their decision. Finally, the board leader stood up. Given the new information and testimonies, we need to reevaluate the fines and the actions taken against this homeowner, he announced. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Karen's influence was diminishing, and the truth was coming out. Karen tried one last time to defend herself, but her words fell flat. The board decided to retract the fines and review the HOA's communication methods to ensure everyone was properly informed in the future. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as the meeting concluded. Neighbors approached me, thanking me for standing up and sharing their own stories. It was a moment of unity and victory. As I left the hall, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The journey had been tough, but I had stood up for myself and helped others do the same. I knew the neighborhood would be better for it, and I had gained confidence and new friends along the way. But just as I was about to head home, I glanced back and saw Karen standing at the edge of the parking lot, her eyes watching me closely. There was something in her gaze that made me uneasy. Had she truly given up, or was there more to come? The peace felt fragile, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of our story.